Well, the governor of Delta State in southern Nigeria, Sheriff Oberewori, has called for improved capacity building to mitigate the impact of climate change in the country. Now, the governor made the appeal at the launch of a capacity building workshop on climate change for communities in this state. Well, to take this conversation further afield, we are now being joined by Joseph Owolabi, the founder of Rubicon Consulting and a former leader of Ernst Young, especially on how Nigerians can benefit from climate change through capacity building. Always great to have you here. Thank you for joining the program this afternoon.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So climate change, a big topic of discussion. Can you, first of all, start off telling us climate change and capacity building, how those two go hand in hand?
Fantastic. Yeah. So climate change, as many would say, is an existential risk, right? And so this century, there's been a lot of focus on climate change. And for the layman here on the streets, how does that affect them? Of course, they can see some of the effects of what we call human-made climate change, and for us in Lagos, is floodings that we've been seeing.
Extreme heat.
Extreme heat. And also, you know, if you think about northeast Nigeria with Lake Chad and all of the terrorism we've seen from the north, it's because communities have been displaced and what have you. And also we know that in the south-south, some of the effects of extractive industries and shell and all of the issues there. So I think when it comes to climate change, there needs to be that awareness. So a lot of people don't see how it directly impacts on their socio-economic status. And I think, you know, initiatives like we've seen in the state, by the state government there, kind of sheds the light on what people need to know, how they can help mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change.
And could you tell us a little more about those initiatives for those who might not be aware?
So, you know, there are a couple of initiatives. If you take the public sector as an example, so governments around the world during the time of President Obama, around 2015, did sign what we call the Paris Agreement.
Right.
And that sets at a high level big goals and, you know, big plans around curbing emissions. So scientists have asserted that, you know, surface temperature of the Earth should not go past 2 degrees Celsius at some point, now 1.5, because when that happens, there are health implications. We know that cancer has been on the rise, like you mentioned and alluded to. Heat waves, not just in Nigeria, we've seen that across Europe in the last 5-10 years and a lot of other places, Australia where I live, and many other parts of the world. There's been extreme heat waves, there's been earthquakes, there's been flooding in Pakistan. You know, we saw what happened in Tanzania, Kenya recently. So there are many effects of this. In Australia, the last 4 years, we had what we call our own black swan, and it was the bushfires that ravaged the entire continent. All of these effects of climate change are there for everyone to see. And therefore, we need to play a key role. So the government played a role in setting up the policy, but there is a gap. Private sector individuals need to understand the role they play in all of that policy for that to have real impact.
So it's about bringing home the importance of how it impacts our lives. That can be hard to get across, especially in a nation where messages are hard to get across. I mean, we have the cost of living crisis. Apart from the extreme heat and all the other things we're doing, there's issues with the minimum wage. People are living hand to mouth. There's just quite a lot of immediate issues that everyday Nigerians have to deal with. How do you reorientate their minds to see the bigger picture and realize that most of these small issues or these big issues we're dealing with all directly relate to climate change or the warming of the climate?
And that's interesting because you touched on the key issue there. It's how do we localize the message to have real, you know, relevance to people at the grassroots, whether they be in a city such as Lagos, cosmopolitan city, or in the remote areas of Nigeria, south here, southwest, all over the country, across the geopolitical zones. And I think the message there is when you think about climate change and sustainability, as many will call it, a common acronym is ESG, and that's environmental, social, and governance issues. For us in Africa, it's largely the social issues, right? Because the big economies, the US, the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, for them, it's the emissions. Because they fold all of their industrial revolutions based out of fossil fuel. And so they emit a lot of the world's greenhouse gases. But for us in Africa, apart from South Africa, which is on the top 20, which emits 1% of the global emissions, countries like Nigeria and other countries across Africa are not really big on emissions. And so for me, the message is on social issues because we have a lot of that social impact. From places like Nigeria, where you have people, the cocoa farm here in Nigeria and Ghana, to the South, where I mentioned earlier, where, traditionally fishermen, their rivers have been, polluted by oil exploration in that region. So I think the light has to be shed on the social issues. And a lot of people have also talked about some of the repatriations that needs to be done by the West in terms of slave trade and all of that. So I think until Africa begins to take that message, which the West is taking forward, and localize it to our own issues and how relevant it is for us, then it will make sense to the average person on the streets, where we're struggling, like you mentioned, in Nigeria with high cost of living, forex issues, low minimum wage, and what have you.
It's almost like they need to pay an Afrobeats musician or one of these Nollywood movie houses to create some kind of narrative that can permeate the public's consciousness of how it directly affects them, because people speaking plenty English on news. I mean, I don't really know how much it's going to get across, but hopefully it gets there. But there also is that criticism from the West, or of the West. Just like you said, their emissions are high. And there's a lot of pressure on African nations to do more about their own greenhouse gases, et cetera, when it seems like the West is not only more capable, but also is a little bit more culpable as well. And the pressure that they're putting on African countries who have not yet reached that industrial revolution like they have, in order to get them to the level that they need to be. So what do you make of those criticisms?
I think we just need to be balanced here, right? And I do understand some of those criticisms in terms of, the UK, Australia, US, and all of the big countries have literally fueled their own development on the back of fossil fuel.
Exactly.
Right? From the locomotive and train, industrial revolution and all of that. However, we also need to understand that we're in a global village, right? And like this current administration is big on inflows of foreign direct investment. Some of our banks are listed on the London Stock Exchange. We have, instruments that are listed on Luxembourg. So we're actually connected to the world more than we think. So we can't, to a large extent, be on the other extreme. However, we need to find a way to still prioritize local development. So countries like India have prioritized local development. They've said we need to continue to do that. China has also done that at some point. In places like Australia, some of the political parties have insisted that until we have what we call a transitional arrangement, where we don't leave out all the communities. So if you're saying leave fossil fuel, Dangote is just building a refinery and we still need energy. So how do we find that balance? So we need to, obviously, we all know, we agree now, there's enough overwhelming evidence to suggest that climate change is real. So we need to do something. However, there needs to be a balance between how do we ensure that there's appropriate stakeholder management, nobody's left behind. What are the new skills that will be relevant in the future? There's a lot of talk about carbon markets and all of the job it will create. The solar industry, we've started seeing investment into going into solar in Nigeria. We need to know that those jobs won't start immediately and they won't be that spike. So how do we manage all of those that will lose their jobs as we begin to transition? And that's the engagement, that's the conversation we need to have. And it needs to be not just public sector. What we've seen all over the world is that the government set the policy. The US by 2030 wants 50% of its motor vehicles to be electronic vehicles, but they're not carrying private sector along. And so with Tesla and all of that, they still can't meet the demand. So how do we carry the private sector along? And that will be the challenge for a country as Nigeria. It's good to see the government moving forward. We set by issuing the first sovereign green bond in Africa in 2016, and all of the first that we're doing in Nigeria, which is good. However, we need to ensure that private sector is part of that conversation, because when it comes to implementation, it will be driven by the private sector.
Well, you couldn't have said it any better. It's about balance and rising to the challenge, and it is great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for stopping by today, Joseph Owolabi, founder of the Rubicon Consulting and former Ernst & Young leader. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure is mine. Thank you for having me.